Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's morning here where I am. It's really quiet, and I wanted to talk to you today. This is my Mindfulness Mondays. So I'm trying to navigate the world, and lately I just have felt like crying all the time. Like, oh my gosh, there's like this lump in my throat about what's going on in the entire world, not just in North America, but everywhere. So yesterday I posed a question on my Facebook page. It was a blog that was written that had 28, can you believe this? 28 points on where we lack what I like to call cultural intelligence. Sometimes people call it cultural humility, but it's the idea that we think we know each other, and in all actuality we don't. And I think that if your interactions or your examples of different cultures comes from television shows, like you don't know anybody who's different from you, and any peek into a different culture comes from what you see on TV, then you can't help but be biased. My very good friend and yoga teacher, Dr. Gail Park, and I talk a lot about race and yoga and social justice. And I once had a conversation with her when she was being featured on a television show, and the director and the producer of the television show was there. And she said, "Why does everything on TV always deal in stereotypes?" And the producer said to her, "Because it works. People buy into the stereotype because it makes for good television." That kind of blew my mind, right? Like, I know people in the 90s were watching The Cosby Show and A Different World and thought that that was a peek into Black culture, and now they were like experts in Black culture by watching these TV shows that were looked at a very small part of the population. And the same way that there's diversity in white culture, and that all white culture comes from the same place, there's diversity in Black culture. So I'm working with the Art of Yoga project. This conversation is all over the place, I'm sorry. And we were talking about all the different ways that you can be Black, right? And this was really interesting because Mary, the creator and founder of the project, said to me, "How do you identify? Do you call yourself an African American?" And I don't, because I'm not American. And I know I'm African from way back because the country of my origin is Barbados, and that was part of an enslaved population. So I know that came from Africa. So I know that my history comes from Africa, but I certainly, as a Canadian, don't identify as an African American. And if I had to label myself, I would probably call myself a Caribbean Canadian. But for the most part, I just kind of consider myself Canadian or Black. And Black people in Canada come from all kinds of places, you know, from the Underground Railway, right, that ended up here, especially in the border city in which I live in Windsor. There's a lot of history around that. There's people that come from Africa who are here. There's people who come from the Caribbean who are here, and there's people who are Black people who have been here for generations. So there's lots of different ways to be Black, the same way there's lots of different ways to be any ethnicity or culture. So I think it's really interesting when we have these conversations around culture and racism and bigotry, and knowing the difference between the two. I think that's really, really interesting, and I'm grateful for the conversations that happen here. I guess my question, or the point of this conversation today is to be mindful of how we think of each other, and be maybe aware of some of our biases and prejudices, because believe it or not, we all have bias and we all have bigotry, because it's what we've been taught. You know, all this information or all these ideas came down, and we were all affected. When you don't hear anything about the accomplishments that different cultures have contributed to North America, then you tend to be biased about who contributes to society. I was on, you know, I'm always Googling stuff on race and culture, and I was on a Google Yahoo Answers page, and somebody said, "Wouldn't it just be better if we were all the same culture, and that way none of us would be fighting?" And I'm thinking, how homogenous, and what if there was only one kind of food? What if there was only like spaghetti? There were no other kinds of food. How boring would that be? So I think it's really great that people on this page are interested in talking about culture and diversity and race and racism, and I appreciate all the viewpoints and all the conversations. It gives me a peek into what our society and culture believes. But I have to say, almost 60 years after the Civil Rights Movement, I can't believe we haven't moved any further forward. It's kind of disappointing. So your mindfulness practice today is, what are some of your biases and why do you have them? Just a thought, just a question. Anyway, back to the mat. I'm taping a whole bunch of new content for Yoga Steya today, and I'm already exhausted. I've been taping for 2 hours, but it's a full day. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to my ramblings, and I'll catch you next Monday on Mindfulness Mondays. Ciao, everybody.